The late afternoon sun leaned low over the desert town of Dry Creek, its rays spilling down the empty street where dust whispered across wooden planks and loose barrels. The town looked as if it had been holding its breath for weeks. Doors shut, curtains drawn, the silence of people who had learned that showing themselves too openly brought nothing but trouble. Only one figure stood in view, a woman on the porch of the Mercantile, her arms folded as if to hold together what little was left of her world. Her name was Clara Mercer, though most in town called her by harsher titles, the kind reserved for women left alone. Her husband had ridden away 2 years before, with the last of their savings and a promise he never meant to keep. The cabin he left behind leaned crooked, patched with scrap tin and boards she scavenged herself. It was not much, but it was all she had. She worked with the hands she had, scrubbing clothes, mending fences, cooking meals for ranch hands when coin allowed. Survival became her routine pride, her armor, suspicion, her weapon. On that day the horizon shifted. A rider appeared, dust trailing behind like smoke. She felt her stomach knot instantly. Strangers were rarely salvation. They carried debts, violence, or hungers they tried to satisfy at another's expense. She watched as the figure drew closer, his shoulders hunched from days on the trail, his horse ribbed and tired, his face half hidden beneath the brim of a hat. He was the sort of man who looked like the desert had claimed a piece of him already. When he dismounted at the water pump, Clara stepped forward before he could draw the bucket. Her heart raced with old fears, but she hid them beneath words sharp as barbed wire. She called out, asking whether his mind was always between her legs, whether that was why he seemed so lost. It was a test, a wall thrown quick and hard. If he sneered, if he laughed, if he moved with swagger, she would leave before the pattern she knew too well repeated itself. But he did none of those things. Instead, he worked the pump handle in silence, filled the bucket, and offered it to her first without a word. There was no smirk, no demand. Just a gesture. It left her unsettled because she had expected the opposite. When he later laid his coat across her shoulders against the sudden bite of wind pride nearly forced her to refuse, yet she let it rest there. It had been too long since anyone gave without pressing for return. She studied him carefully. His clothes were worn, his beard uneven, his revolver riding low on his hip. He looked like a drifter who carried debts that could never be repaid. But there was a steadiness in his silence, something that made her curious despite herself. When she finally led him down the dirt path to her cabin, she did so with caution sharp in her chest. The place sagged on its hinged roof, patched with whatever she could find. She expected him to sneer. Instead, he crouched, tested the door with practiced hands, and set to fixing it with a bent nail and scrap wire from his saddlebag. She stood in the doorway, watching confusion pricking her. She had lived so long bracing for someone to tear her down, not put things back together. That night he sat on her porch with rifle across his knees, hat pulled low, eyes scanning the dark. Coyotes cried in the distance, the desert wind carrying their hunger. Inside, Clara lay awake listening. She should have barred the door against him, should have forced him away after he fixed the hinge. Yet she left the bolt only half drawn. In the quiet, she wondered what kind of man he was, why he had come, why he stayed. The next days fell into a rhythm she could not have predicted. He fetched water from the well before dawn, tended his horse with patience, and worked on the fence line without being asked. When they went into town together for supplies, she felt the weight of every eye on her. Whispers curled like smoke from lips of men leaning on the saloon rail. The storekeeper's wife glanced at her with judgment. The clerk raised his brow as though tallying up her worth. She braced herself for humiliation, but when the cowboy placed his own coins on the counter to share the cost, something shifted in her chest. His silence carried weight. Not the silence of a man plotting, but the silence of one who had already carried too much. She began to see that in every scar across his knuckles, in the way he never asked about her past yet understood its shadow. Trouble came one hot afternoon when a writer delivered a folded paper claiming her land was bound by debt, a lien signed by her vanished husband. Her shame burned anew, fury twisting with helplessness. But the cowboy stepped forward, voice low, pointing out the missing stamp, the absent seal, the lack of witness marks. He named the paper worthless, and though the writer left with a sneer, his words steadied her heart. Still, fear lingered. Men with money could send more than paper. She carried the document in her shawl to the marshal. His verdict was clear. The claim worthless, another trick by a man named Rollins. It eased the noose around her chest, yet she knew threats could still ride back. As if testing their resolve, the desert threw a storm upon them days later. Black clouds built over the ridge wind, tearing at the cabin, rain slashing sideways. Together they fought to hold it, him hammering tin back in place, her bracing the door against the howl. In that night of fury, with water dripping through seams and thunder cracking the ground, they endured side by side. When dawn broke, gray, and the cabin still stood something inside, Clara shifted. Survival had been her mission alone for so long. Yet here was proof that two people could outlast more than one. The morning after the storm, the marshal returned with news Rollins had been caught, his schemes collapsing. The lien that haunted her was gone for good. Her cabin, frail as it seemed, was finally hers without question. She looked at the cowboy, then the man who had walked into her life with silence, fixed her door, faced her fears, and weathered the storm at her side. Her words came slow but steady. He could keep moving, she said, or he could stay. He answered simply that he was tired of drifting. If she would have him, he would remain. And for the first time in years, Clara felt the ground beneath her steadier than before. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm Clara had almost forgotten was possible. Mornings began with the sound of his boots across the porch as he went to check the rope on the well or the fence line beyond the chicken coop. She would rise to the faint scrape of metal against wood, the steady rhythm of someone working without complaint. He never asked where to begin. He simply saw what needed doing and did it. Clara found herself watching more than she admitted. She told herself it was caution, that she needed to know the measure of the man she had let so close. But truth lingered underneath. There was something in the way he moved, quiet, deliberate, no wasted effort, that unsettled her in ways she couldn't name. Her own chores felt lighter, not because the work had changed, but because the weight of doing it alone had eased. When she patched the coop with boards scavenged from the old shed, he set posts deeper into the earth for the fence. When she planted beans in shallow rows, he steadied the corral rail so the wind wouldn't snap it again. Silence lay between them most of the time, but it was a silence that carried no judgment. At night, he still slept on the porch, rifle laid across his knees, listening for coyotes or riders. She lay awake on her narrow bed, the lamp burning low, her mind restless. Part of her wanted him gone, not because of what he had done, but because of what he might do, what any man might do once trust opened too wide. Yet each morning when she stepped out, he was there, shoulders stiff from sleeplessness, eyes steady, horse tied close. And each morning she felt something loosen in her chest. The town, however, was not so forgiving. When she rode in with him for supplies again, whispers followed her. Women turned their faces, men smirked openly. One spat in the dirt and called out something meant to shame her. She braced herself for a fight, but the cowboy only kept walking, his silence louder than any insult. For the first time, she realized that not every battle needed to be fought with words. Sometimes refusing to feed the fire starved it faster. One evening, after a day spent hammering loose boards into place, she found herself speaking aloud. Truth she had kept hidden for years. She told him about her husband, how he had sold the last quart of wood one winter for whiskey, how she had carried bruises to the pump in silence. She told him about the debts left behind, about the papers men brought to her door, each one threatening to strip away the only ground she still held. Her voice trembled, but her jaw stayed set. He listened without interruption, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the dirt. When the silence stretched, he spoke of his own past. A foreman in New Mexico who had lent him a horse a cattle drive that ended in violence, a sheriff who had run him out before he could pay his debts, a brother buried under a nameless ridge. He said it simply, without asking for pity, without trying to excuse himself. Clara studied him, then seeing not just a drifter, but a man carrying weight that matched her own. The shapes were different, but the burden the same. Something inside her eased, though fear still lingered. She had trusted before and been burned. Yet there in the low light, with his voice rough from disuse and his silence steady, she felt the edge of trust begin again. The days wore on. He worked at the livery in town part-time, earning coin without complaint. She traded her washing for hens, their soft clucking filling the yard with a sound that made the place feel less hollow. Together they carved initials into the inside edge of the door, Not for anyone else to see, but for themselves, a mark that said the cabin was not just hers or his, but theirs. Storms still came. Debts still shadowed, whispers still clung to her name in town. But when the roof held after another night of wind, when the corral rail stood against the weight of her mare, when she lit the lamp and the glass no longer rattled with every gust, she realized the cabin was stronger than it had been in years. And so was she. The cabin's rhythm grew firmer with each passing week. Clara woke to the sound of a hammer striking nails or the scrape of wood against stone as the cowboy hauled new posts from the ridge. She sometimes caught herself lingering in the doorway, watching him work in the dawn light. The sight unsettled her not because it frightened her, but because it softened something she had fought hard to keep unyielding. In town, tongues wagged louder with every visit they made together. Women who once turned their backs now whispered behind their hands. Men leaned at the saloon rail, smirking, certain they knew the shape of what bound Clara to this drifter. She kept her chin high, though her stomach twisted each time. Shame and defiance mixed in her chest, but the cowboy's steady silence anchored her. When he ignored the taunts, she felt the choice pressing against her, whether to keep defending herself with sharp words or to let his way of silence shield her. At the store, she laid her list on the counter. Flour, salt, nails, lamp oil. The clerk raised a brow, his gaze flicking to the cowboy at her side. Before she could snap back, the man beside her set down his own coins. Fewer than hers, but enough to share the weight. The act pierced deeper than she expected. Not because of the money itself, but because he had chosen to stand with her without demanding anything in return. The ride back was quiet except for the rhythm of hooves. Clara studied the horizon, jaw set against the voices that still clung to her ears. When they reached the cabin, he carried the bundles inside, laid them on the table, then crouched to fit the glass pane into the window frame. She stood nearby, hands busy with twine, but her eyes kept sliding toward him. The way he worked spoke louder than any words could. Each nail driven, each knot tied was an answer to the questions that had haunted her nights. One evening as dusk fell and coyotes howled in the distance, she found herself watching him by lantern light. He was cleaning his rifle motions, slow and methodical. She felt the urge to speak, to ask why he stayed, why he had not drifted on as so many before him had. The words caught in her throat. Instead, she ladled thin stew into two bowls and set one in front of him. He nodded once, a gesture so plain, yet filled with something that unsettled her more than any flattery could have. But peace never held long on the frontier. A rider appeared one afternoon, dust curling behind his horse, a folded paper in his vest. He threw it onto the porch boards, declaring her land bound by debts her husband had left. The words cut her deep shame, twisting like a knife. But the cowboy stepped forward, his voice low, and even pointing out the paper's flaws. No stamp, no seal, no witness. Worthless. The rider sneered but rode off without pressing further. Clara's hands shook as she held the crumpled paper, but when she looked at the cowboy, she found steadiness in his eyes. Together they carried the claim to the marshal. His office smelled of tobacco and old wood, his eyes sharp as he read. Worthless, he said, tossing the paper aside. Rollins again, a name that stirred the anger of many who had been fooled before. The walk back to the cabin carried a new weight. Relief, yes, but also the knowledge that threats would not vanish overnight. Clara felt the familiar tension coil in her chest, but when she saw the cowboy set his coat across her shoulders against the evening chill, she let it remain. It was not weakness to accept warmth, she told herself. It was survival of a different kind. That night, with the lamp burning low and the window no longer rattling in the wind, Clara lay awake listening to the steady scrape of the cowboy's breath on the porch. The storm of her fears had not ended, but for the first time she felt she did not stand against it alone. The storm that came days later did not arrive with riders or papers, but with the sky itself. Black clouds stacked high over the western ridge, swallowing the light until the land below seemed small and fragile. Clara stood on the porch, arms folded tight, watching the horizon churn. The air carried that heavy stillness she had learned to fear, the kind that pressed on her chest before the rain broke. The cowboy moved without wasting breath. He climbed onto the roof with nails and wire hammering tin sheets that rattled beneath the rising wind. Each strike echoed across the valley, sharp against the growing howl. Clara dragged rugs away from the threshold, shifted jars low on the shelves, braced herself for what she knew was coming. When the first drops fell, they slapped hard against the dirt fat and loud turning dust to mud in minutes. The wind howled through the gaps in the boards, tugging at the corners of the roof. Clara pressed her weight against the door when it shook in its frame, her heart pounding with memories she hated to recall nights when fists had battered that same door bruises, left as proof. She reminded herself this was different. No drunken rage, no cruel laughter, only the storm. Yet her body trembled all the same. The cowboy returned from the roof, soaked through, eyes narrowed against the rain. Without a word, he shoved the table against the window, steadying it against the force. Lantern low, he told her, his voice rough but calm. She lit it just enough to hold back the dark. Together they moved in silence, sealing cracks, shifting what could be saved. When a board snapped in the corral with a sound like gunfire, Clara flinched, fear clawing at her chest. The cowboy grabbed his rifle and lantern, plunging into the gale to check the damage. She pressed against the door, watching his shadow move across the yard, each heartbeat heavy with the thought he might not return. Then he pushed back inside, soaked and steady, his breath calm. Horses are safe, rail held. The storm howled long into the night. Rain bled through seams in the roof, dripping into the pans Clara placed just in time. She sat at the table, hands wrapped around a cup she did not drink, eyes fixed on the flickering lantern. Across from her, the cowboy sat with rifle balanced across his knees, watching the door, as if daring the storm to test him. The silence between them shifted. It was no longer heavy with suspicion, but weighted with endurance shared. Hours dragged slow. Clara's arms ached from holding herself rigid, her ears tuned to every creak, every whistle of wind. Yet when she looked at him, still watchful, steady, she found herself breathing easier. For years she had stood against storms alone, body braced, heart clenched. Now she faced one with someone beside her. By dawn the wind eased, rain softening to a patter, then to silence. The cabin leaned but still stood, the roof scarred but not broken, the corral shaken but whole. Clara stepped outside barefoot into the gray light mud, sucking at her toes, the land around her battered yet unbowed. She looked at the cowboy, water dripping from his hat brim, exhaustion plain across his face. He gave her a small nod, nothing more, but in it she heard what words could not carry. If they could outlast this storm, perhaps they could outlast what else waited on the horizon. The morning after the storm carried a sweetness Clara had not tasted in years. The air smelled clean, the sky washed pale, as if the land itself had been scrubbed of its scars. She stepped onto the porch, bare feet sinking into damp wood, and let her lungs fill with the coolness. For the first time she looked at her cabin not only as a shelter patched together, but as a place that had held a place worth keeping. The cowboy led his horse from the corral, barley from town, already filling its ribs. The animal looked calmer, steady again. He patted its neck before tying it to the rail with a knot he knew would not slip. When he looked up, Clara caught the faintest smile flicker across his face, weary but real. It was the first time she had seen anything close to ease in him. Their quiet was broken by a rider trailing dust along the path. Clara's stomach tightened at once. She braced herself for another threat, another demand. But when the man dismounted, boots sinking in soft ground, she saw the badge pinned to his vest. The marshal. He carried no weapon drawn, only the authority of a man who had seen too much trouble to be fooled by paper tricks. He wiped his brow and told them Rollins had been caught, tried the same scheme on a cattle buyer in Santa Fe, and failed. The lien Clara had been shown was as dead as the man who signed it. The ground she stood on was hers. Clara felt her shoulders straighten as if some invisible chain had been cut. She had lived years under the shadow of her husband's debts, waiting for them to strip away the last of what she owned. Now the marshal's words rang like iron. Yours. When the lawman rode off, dust curling behind him, Clara turned to the cowboy. His eyes studied her, steady and unreadable, as if he were waiting for her choice. She understood then that nothing bound him here. With the debt gone and her claim secure, he could ride on into the desert, leaving no trace but the nails in her door and the posts in her fence. Her throat tightened, but she spoke plainly. You could keep moving debts behind you, storms ahead. Or you could stay. This place could use another pair of hands. He looked at the cabin, the fence line, the corral, then back at her. His answer came simple. I'm tired of moving. If you'll have me, I'll stay. The words struck deeper than any promise. Clara nodded once, not trusting herself to say more. Relief moved through her chest in a wave stronger than she wanted to show. For the first time since her husband's shadow had vanished into the desert, she felt the ground beneath her steady, not just because it was hers, but because someone had chosen to stand on it with her. In the days that followed, life bent toward a new rhythm. He signed on at the livery in town, working honest hours for honest pay, the kind that didn't leave debts chasing him down. She bartered her washing for hens, their clucking filling the yard with life again. At dusk, they walked the fence line together, two silhouettes against a wide horizon, shoulders carrying different pasts but the same present. Inside the cabin, they carved their initials into the inside edge of the door. Small, private, not for others to see. Clara ran her fingers over the grooves after the knife pulled away, and something in her chest loosened. It was proof not of ownership, but of belonging. Still, doubt lingered at the edges. The town's whispers had not faded. Neighbors would talk louder now, certain she had bound herself to another drifter, certain she had not learned from the last. At night, lying on her narrow bed, Clara heard those voices in her mind. But when she listened beyond them, she heard the slow rhythm of his breath outside the door, the scrape of his boots when he walked the porch, the steady thud of his hammer in daylight. And she realized the only voices that mattered were the ones inside these walls, the ones that chose to build instead of tear down. The weeks turned into something Clara had not thought she would ever claim again: routine. Mornings began with smoke rising from the small stove. The smell of oats stretched thin with water. She would set out two bowls now, without hesitation, one for herself, one for the man who had stayed. He always ate in silence, shoulders squared, spoon steady, never asking for more than what she offered. She came to value that silence not as distance, but as respect. Together they tended the land. He hauled new rails for the fence, setting them deep so they would not snap in the next storm. She patched the chicken coop with boards, salvaged from the shed, hammering until her hands blistered. In the evenings, they walked the line side by side, inspecting posts, tightening ropes, repairing what needed to hold. Their words were few, but the work spoke loudly enough. In town, tongues still wagged, but Clara found herself less shaken by them. The women's stares, the men's smirks, they no longer cut as sharply as before. When one man spat in the dust and muttered about her bringing a drifter home, she felt the heat rise in her chest, ready to snap back. But before she could, the cowboy's silence anchored her again. His refusal to answer seemed stronger than any insult. She realized then she did not need to fight every battle with her tongue. Sometimes endurance itself was victory. One evening after a long day of work, she found herself telling him more of her past than she ever had. She spoke of her husband's cruelty, of nights when he had vanished with coin meant for food, of the shame of facing the pump with bruises she could not hide. Her voice trembled, but her eyes did not drop. The cowboy listened, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his face set but not pitying. When she finished, he nodded once, a small gesture, but it told her he had heard. Then for the first time he spoke of his own scars, of the brother buried beneath a nameless ridge of debts he had carried across deserts of the cattle drive that had ended in violence he could not undo. His voice was low, roughened by the weight of memory, but he did not ask for sympathy. Clara saw then that his silence was not emptiness, but a shield forged by grief as much as caution. Something shifted between them that night. The air in the cabin felt less hollow. The lamp's glow seemed warmer against the patched walls. She realized that trust was not something given all at once, but something built nail by nail, post by post, word by word. Still, doubts crept in during the quiet hours. When the wind rattled loose boards, she wondered if the next storm would undo everything they had built. When she caught her reflection in the cracked tin mirror, she saw the lines carved by years of strain and asked herself if any man would stay when he saw them too clearly. But each time the cowboy's actions answered before her fears could take root. When he brought home a sack of barley for his horse and a lock for her door, when he mended the roof without being asked, when he took his place on the porch at night with his rifle laid across his knees, she understood that some men spoke their promises not with words but with the steadiness of their hands. The cabin began to change in ways Clara could feel as much as see. The air inside no longer whistled through cracks. The hens clucked softly in the yard. The corral held against the push of restless hooves. Even the silence carried a new shape, not the silence of loneliness, but of company too careful to break what was fragile. And in those small shifts, Clara felt herself begin to change as well. The summer deepened, stretching long days across the desert, where heat shimmered above the ground like a veil. Clara found herself rising earlier than she once had, not because she feared the work would overwhelm her, but because she wanted to meet the morning with steadier hands. The cowboy was already outside, most days sleeves rolled, tending to his horse or checking the fence line. Their lives had grown into a rhythm so familiar, it felt as though it had always been there, though only weeks had passed. Town remained a place of sharp whispers and sidelong glances, but even that began to change. When Clara rode in with him to buy flour or nails, the clerks still looked with their raised brows. Yet she noticed something different in the way the townsfolk watched. It was no longer just suspicion or mockery, it was caution. They saw the man beside her, the steadiness of his silence, the way he carried himself like someone who would not be moved by small men's talk. The marshal's word about Rollins had spread. Men no longer appeared at her porch with false papers, and for the first time in years, she slept without fear that another debt would claw back what was hers. The cabin was not grand, not even comfortable by most measures, but it stood strong. The new rails held the roof no longer leaked. The hens scratched in the dirt, and the window panes stayed clear against the wind. In the evenings, they often sat by the lamp, its glow warm against patched walls. Clara would mend shirts while he cleaned his rifle or carved notches into a length of wood. Their silences spoke more than conversations ever could. Sometimes she caught herself watching the line of his jaw, the scars on his hands, the way his shoulders sloped with weariness, yet never slackened with defeat. She thought often of the night of the storm, of the way he had stood steady against the wind, refusing to let the cabin fall. She thought of the marshal's verdict, the words that freed her from the shadow of debts that had haunted her for too long. And she thought of his answer when she asked him to stay plain, without flourish, spoken like a truth he had carried for years. One evening, as the horizon bled red with sunset, Clara stood on the porch and looked out across the land. It was still rough, still scarred, but it was hers. More than that, it was theirs. She felt the strange weight of something she had not dared name in years: hope. The cowboy stepped up beside her, setting his coat across her shoulders, as he always did when the air cooled. She let it rest there, no longer fighting the pride that once made her refuse. Together they watched the last light sink behind the ridge. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice low. "I used to think this place was only something to survive. Now I think it might be something to live in." He looked at her, eyes steady, and nodded once. "Then let's live in it." The words were simple, but they rooted deep. Clara felt them settle into her chest like nails hammered into solid wood. That night she did not bolt the door halfway. She slid it open for him, set two bowls on the table without hesitation, and when the lamp burned low, she did not listen for the scrape of boots outside. Instead, she listened to the steady rhythm of his breath under the same roof. For listeners who might wonder why she had let him stay, why she had opened herself again after so many wounds, the answer was plain enough. Because he built instead of broke, because he stood instead of fled, because he gave instead of took. The Wild West was still hard, still unforgiving. Storms would come again. Whispers would never fade entirely, and debts of the past would always cast shadows. But in the quiet of that cabin, patched and scarred though it was, two people had chosen to stay. And that choice, more than any storm or threat, was what would endure.